Hello, this is Krystal, and thank you for joining me for this week's First Chapter Friday. Today I will be reading from the first chapter of Once We Were Here by Christopher Cosmos. Hope you enjoy. Chapter 1, October 28th, 1940. The town of Agria sits below a large bluff, nestled against the radiant azure waters of the Aegean Sea, not far from the great eastern port of Volos. It's a fishing village, and everything about it is dedicated to the water and maritime life, as so many of the Hellenic cities and islands are, and have been since before anyone can remember. Alexei's father was a fisherman, as his father was before that, and his father before him. So Alexei learned to cast a fishing net when he was very young, before he was even 6 years old, and his suntanned arms were strong enough to pull in a full haul of myriads, or lavraki, before his 13th birthday. He was a boy who grew up slowly, beside the sea, in a corner of the world where everything was carefully crafted out of beauty and full of an ancient history as storied and rich as time itself. It was a few months past Alexei's 18th birthday, and though he'd been fishing with his father for some years by then, he'd recently been trying to make as many excuses as he could to take their boat out alone. When he was younger, Alexei's father seemed as large as Zeus to his son, a great bear of a man, a god amongst all the other ordinary fathers that Alexei knew in their town, and someone not destined to suffer the same fate as other mortals. Ioannis was only 5'9", 3 inches shorter than how tall his son stood now. But there was once a time when Alexei thought he'd never reach his father's height. It wasn't until years later that he realized that sometimes it's how a man lives his life that makes him seem taller. Ioannis had left Greece and traveled the world at 19, going to college in Paris before returning home to fight in the Great War, taking a bullet in the leg fighting with the Greek army against the Bulgarians when they invaded Thrace in 1918. Alexei used to ask his father many times for stories from the war, expecting feats of daring and heroism, tales to rival those of Homer and Achilles. But all he used to say to his son was, "We won, Alexandros. That's all you need to know." Ioannis's response became a mantra, the same word always following the same word, each syllable pronounced exactly the same way. It wasn't until Alexei was older that it occurred to him that he might have been asking his father to relive. But what Alexei did know is that in the last few years, Ioannis's legs started bothering him more and more, to the point where Alexei saw his father, the Greek god, the man he thought of as Zeus, someone to rival Achilles himself in the eyes of a young boy, start walking with a slight limp that had become more noticeable with each passing year. He would never admit it, a proud and stubborn man. But a son who spent so many mornings on a boat with his father could see the toll the work was beginning to take on him. But it was as it should be. Old men are meant to slow down, and young men are meant to take up for them. And Alexei was happy to do his part. So Alexei learned to make excuses to wake up early and go out on the boat alone, telling Ioannis that he needed to practice by himself, without a father there telling a son everything that he was doing wrong. Anything Alexei could think of to keep him at home at least a few more days a week, instead of out on the sea, where he'd been since he was a boy. And it was on one such morning, when Alexei had taken the boat out alone, that the entire world changed. That fall had been particularly good for fishing, in a way that some falls are, and it's impossible to explain. And Alexei had already filled 3 nets before the sun was high enough in the sky to signal that it was midday. That summer, he'd started diving for sponges, too. He'd found a cove up the coast to the north of Agria, where they were still plentiful because no other fishermen had found it yet. And after he collected them, he could sell the sponges for 50 drachmae apiece in the agora. Alexei enjoyed the days when he could strip off his clothes and dive into the ocean, going as far down as his lungs would allow, which day after day was getting progressively deeper and longer. He'd gather the sponges off the rocks and load them into a special sack that he'd woven just for the task, then come bursting back up to the surface. And it became his favorite part of the day, when he'd climb back onto the boat and allow himself to lay still for a few moments as the hot Mediterranean sun would bake the leftover salt onto his skin. It felt like youth to him, and like freedom. He was an adventurer alone on the open sea, the hero of his own story, the same as all the other heroes who he'd grown up with. Achilles, Odysseus, Alexander, the men he thought about when he lay in his bed at night. The great men whose stories they still told. These moments alone with himself and his dreams were innocence, before Alexei ever really knew what innocence was, and certainly long before he knew how easily it could be taken. But the coming fall would be sure to change that forever. As Alexei came back to the shore, his nets full with fish, which could make his father happy, and with a sack full of fresh sponges, he looked into the distance and saw a figure on the beach, standing next to the small and narrow dock, and waving his arms wildly, calling out his name. "Alexei! Alexei!" The words carried across the water. And if you would like to know what happens next, check this title out on the Hoopla app. Thank you and have a wonderful weekend.